You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Sharon Roerty, Senior Program Officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Maki Kawaguchi, a Director at Gehl, to talk about the Inclusive Healthy Places Framework. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Railvolution and appeared first on the Railvolution podcast. You can find the Railvolution podcast on your podcatcher of choice. For a deeper dive on livability issues, or if you want to check out the annual conference this fall, visit railvolution.org. That's railvolution.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We've shared a few of the episodes on our Monday show, but I want to make sure folks hop on over for a behind-the-scenes look at what makes cities tick. Every month, Anthony Flint interviews leading experts, policymakers, and thinkers on topics ranging from housing to climate change to infrastructure, exploring how these issues can all be traced back to land. Some of my favorite recent interviews feature leaders like Lisa Rice of the National Fair Housing Alliance discussing racism and housing policy, and Bill McKibben on decarbonization. So open up your podcatcher and add Land Matters from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Find it on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Join at $2 a month and you'll get a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month and you'll get one of our popular bus-only scarves. And all supporters will have access to bonus audio, including extras from our discussions with guests, such as Carol Martins, Chris Pahalski, and Andrew Simpson of the Philadelphia Office of Transportation, Infrastructure, and Sustainability, and soon Laura Schul of Streetlight Data. Thanks so much for supporting the show. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Well, Sharon Roerty and Maki Kawaguchi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you all tell us a little bit about yourself? We'll start with Maki and then we'll go to Sharon.
Sure. So I'm Maki Kawaguchi. I am a director at an urban design and strategy consultancy named Gehl. And my background is in both architecture and urban design, and really have a passion for all things cities, whether it's about, community building, about transportation, design. But at Gehl, we really focus on sustainability, health, and inclusion. And so I'm very excited to have this conversation with you today.
And hi, thank you for having me. I'm Sharon Roerty. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I work within the foundation. I work on a small team called Global Ideas for U.S. Solutions. And we look outside the U.S. for inspiration, policies, programs, things that are working, again, outside the U.S. that we think we can bring inside the U.S. And sometimes just by going outside the U.S., we get another perspective. And we bring that back in. We bring it into the foundation so that our colleagues can learn from it. We bring the learnings back to our grantees. And we also use other platforms to get them out and engage people in the sort of discoveries, the solutions that we're finding. My background is in urban and environmental planning. I grew up in a city. I've always lived in and around cities. And for me, since I was 10 years old, the big challenge has been starting in one place and trying to figure out how to get to another place miles away and how many different ways you can get there.
Well, we appreciate your expertise. This is actually a part 4 of our series on health and equitable TOD, or transit-oriented communities, I should say. So we talked a little bit about the social determinants of health with Dr. Georges Benjamin. We discussed transit's response to the pandemic with David Huffaker in Pittsburgh. And we talked about building community health outcomes through focused development near transit with Nilda Ruiz and Rose Gray in Philadelphia. So we're excited to have you all on to talk about the subjects that we're talking about today. Like I said, the listeners and I have been diving into this topic about health a little bit. How did you all get involved in this work specifically? I know, Sharon, you talked about, when you were 10 years old, you started focusing on this stuff, but how did you all get involved in this topic matter?
Well, working for Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we're the largest health philanthropy in the United States. So health is what we do, really. And we work through the prism of culture health framework. The social determinants of health are really important to us. Equity. You can't have health unless you have health equity. So that's my connection. And I look, as a planner, I look at the connection between the built environment and health.
So for me, maybe I can share a little bit about my background and my story and how I got here, because obviously there's many things that influence how I got here and why I care about health equity. But I'm a Japanese person who grew up in Madrid in Spain. And, from an early age, I was exposed to many different cultures and urban environments. So I would say from an early age, I was very aware of the different city experiences. And so, of course, I grew up in a very European city with beautiful boulevards and plazas, but also at the same time, in my visits to Japan, I would be exposed to these very organic urban morphologies, which is more common in Asian countries. But I would say that it wasn't until I turned 18 and I moved to Los Angeles. I'd never been there before. It was the first time I moved to Los Angeles to go to college. And I was really actually shocked and fascinated by LA's model of like city planning and urban growth. I really had not seen anything like that in my entire life growing up in Europe and visiting Japan. And so, I'd say like growing up in Madrid, similar to Sharon, what you were saying about when you were 10 years old. When I was 10, I was walking by myself to school, taking public transportation because it was very safe and I had no concerns, right? And of course, as a teenager, I could go around the city without any concerns, and the city was for me to explore. But then when I moved to LA at the age of 18, suddenly that freedom of moving around the city was taken away from me, right? Because I didn't have a driver's license, but I also didn't have a car, and I was completely dependent on my friends to take me around the city. So I felt very restrained in how I experienced the city. And I will say the other thing that was really shocking to me when I moved to LA was to just see how segregated neighborhoods were by race, culture, and socioeconomic status. And I had really never experienced that kind of stark contrast in the cities that I had grown up. So, I was very curious about why does this happen and how do we change this? And, oftentimes in the US, we know about how depending on what zip code you live in, or even if you just cross one street, the experience and the built landscape can completely change, right? And the inequalities in the cities were so clearly demarcated for me, so blatantly obvious. And I was like, how do we change this? How do we change this? And really thinking that, understanding that, these kind of city planning were done by design. It was through design that these kind of inequalities have come to place. And so, Robert Wood Johnson, Gehl, when we started collaborating, we really focused on this idea that place really matters and is integral for both the individual and community health. And so that's sort of a long story, but I wanted to sort of give you like how I explained to you sort of my interest and passion for the work that I do today.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome. We appreciate long stories. Well, so you all have been working on the Inclusive Healthy Places framework. Can you explain a little bit more what it is and what you all set out to do when you started it?
Oh, well, let me give you the origin story of the Inclusive Healthy Places framework. So I work on, as I said, the Global Ideas for US Solutions team. So I'm always thinking about places and the connections to the built environment. But really the inspiration for this work came when I wasn't expecting it. I was on a trip to Australia. I was in Melbourne, Australia, actually to visit my daughter. I hadn't seen her in a year. And she asked me to meet her at this place called Federation Square. She had been working all night and, so I was going to meet her there. So I'm standing waiting for her and, I'm really excited about seeing her. And I'm looking around, I'm thinking this place is different. There's something really special about this place. I didn't know it at the time, but it's built on top of a rail station. So you have that factor. You had bus lines all around. You had all these modes of transportation all around Federation Square. You had all these restaurants and other shops that opened up to it. You had fire pits going on. You had all, benches, all sorts of things. It was a park, it was a public square, it was a place for business, it was a place for transportation. So I knew as I'm looking around scanning the square that something, I'm looking for my daughter, but something special is going on here. And over the course of my trip to Melbourne, which was about 2 weeks long, I kept coming back to Federation Square and kept visiting it. And each time I saw more pieces of it. So I knew it was, again, someplace really, really special. One of the things is it's open 24 hours a day. It has free Wi-Fi for all. anyone could get on the Wi-Fi. Anyone could use the restrooms, free public restrooms that are open 24 hours a day. It had fire pits that anyone can use. There were no signs. I looked for them. There were no signs that said, you can't do this or you can't do that. No loitering, no bike riding, no signs that prohibited activity. So again, over the course of 2 weeks, I knew this place was special. And that's what set me on the course for the Inclusive Healthy Places framework. I thought about it in terms of placemaking, which is a practice we do in the US and throughout the world. Planners engage in placemaking. But what was it? What were the activities that led to this place being this place? What's the history of the place? What's the context of the place? And how do we learn from it? And how do they do, in my mind, still thinking about placemaking, how do they do placemaking in other parts of the world? So I started having conversations with different people that I knew and didn't know that practiced planning and what I figured was placemaking. And one of those conversations was with some folks from Gehl. And as the conversation went on, we embarked on this project. We didn't know it at the time, but developing the Inclusive Healthy Places framework. And we set it out as a tool for evaluating spaces so that we could know beyond design. It's not just about the design of a place, but beyond the design. What got to the design? How do you create a process for inclusive, healthy places? How do you sustain it? How do you measure it? How do you value the history of the place? That was really what got us started.
Maybe I'll just add to that, Sharon, that the guide is really meant to be both a data-driven and very people-first approach to, as Sharon said, evaluating and creating healthy, inclusive public spaces. And it's both, a process and an outcome for us. And it really serves as a tool of metrics that different audiences who work at the intersection of health equity and the physical environment could use as a tool and a roadmap. And it's not meant to be a prescriptive tool, but really a guide and, start to have a conversation and have shared language between different audiences who work both in design, planning, policy making, but also health practitioners.
And as we got into the process, I just want to add that we dropped the term placemaking because that's not what this was about. Placemaking has some connotations that aren't necessarily positive. It doesn't always value the place, or at least it's viewed that way. And equity and inclusion isn't always part of that process. So we really wanted to make that part of the process. So it became Inclusive Healthy Places because equity and inclusion were the drivers within the work that we wanted to do and how to lift up this process that had more to it than placemaking. It was value driven.
Yeah, and why is that evaluation so important? We see placemaking and we see urban design guides and those types of things, but why is the evaluation such a key part of this document and the process as well?
Well, the evaluation is, basically data, and we use both quantitative and qualitative data. So we're not stuck to just one type of data collection, but the data really helps us monitor and evaluate outcomes, right? But also it helps us understand the baseline conditions. So we always try to collect data from the baseline condition and compare it after a project is implemented. And it's a way to sustain and evaluate and continue to tweak and improve any project. And without the data, it's oftentimes you have a project done, there's the ribbon cutting, and that's the end of it. But the reality of a successful public space doesn't end at the ribbon cutting, but that's really actually one of the beginnings of the success of the project. And that monitoring is really key to it.
So often in my work, I'm asked, well, how will I know what is a healthy place? How will I know what is a healthy, inclusive place? What is equity in place? How will I know? And how do I measure it? And how do we sustain it over time? So having a tool and a methodology that allows people in communities, and they don't have to be professionally trained, but people that can collect data, at the beginning of their process, in the middle of their process, and then as the place goes on. Public spaces are living, breathing spaces. So how can it be sustained by the community as a healthy, inclusive place? How will we know when we get there? And then how do we keep it going? So that's what the framework does. And that's why the evaluation piece is so important.
And that's a good point as well, because sometimes it feels like it's hard to get everybody on the same page. In the report, it's mentioned that health professionals and urban planning professionals sometimes are speaking different languages. And so trying to get everybody on the same page seems to be one of the hard parts as well.
That's absolutely right. And the framework is really intended to be a cross-sector framework that helps different, both departments and audiences use data as a common language too. Because oftentimes what you see is, especially in cities, you have different departments working, within their own silos and collecting their own data. But that data is not necessarily cross-evaluated. Or for example, the example that I always give is oftentimes Department of Transportations collect data about the number of vehicles or how many new linear feet of bike trails they've created. But that data is important, but it's also equally important to understand who is using that, right? Not just the product, but also the users. And so this is why it's a very much people-focused approach. The data is also reflective of that people-focused approach. And, we want to understand, well, who is using the parks? Who's using the bike trails? Because, we always talk about the ratio and representation of people. So, we talk about the gender equality or age representation. And we know that when women and children are represented more in public spaces, it's typically perceived as a much safer place. So if we look at a bike trail and we only see, young men in the age of 20s using it, it's not equitable. It's not, it's not for everyone. But if we start seeing women and children also using those bike trails, we understand that the infrastructure is there to create a safer environment so that women, like I as a woman, feel comfortable riding my bike in the urban jungle of Manhattan, right? So the who is really important too.
The data in the framework, there's 4 principles and there's nearly 200 measures, right? And some of those measures are hard data. It's available, public databases, and other measures are measures that just regular people can go and collect. And that is as important as the hard data that's out there, as the traffic data or anything else that exists in publicly collected databases. But even within those metrics, there's room. This is not a hard and fast rule. Within those metrics, the important part is at the outset to say, what do we want to measure as the community groups that engage with this? What do we want to measure over time? What's important to us? And then how can we get that data? Citizen science can be a really important part of this tool. And by citizen science, again, is how just community people can go and collect the data. Who's in the park? Who's in the public space? Who's traveling through the space at different periods of time? Clipboard type data.
Yeah, I have a copy of the color wheel here of all the stuff, and there's a lot on there. How do folks decide what they want to focus on, and how do folks go through those for the context and the process and the sustain and the design and program parts of the data and figure out which pieces they want to collect? Because there is a lot in here to go through.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a very dense framework. There's a lot in there, but again, it's not meant to be prescriptive or, you're not meant to use every single driver or method or metric, but it's really meant to be as a guide. And so I would say the idea is that if you're really focused on like initial stages of your project and you really want to understand context, then you can go through those different drivers, understand which are the most applicable. Like Sharon said, it's meant to be decided with the community, with the people, with the stakeholders, right? So it's really more of a menu than a prescriptive tool, and they go through it and decide what's important to them. And so again, like if they're focused on understanding context, they can look through the lens of the principle of context and then go through that. If they're really interested in the engagement component, there's a whole principle about engagement, right? And there's different ways to engage. So again, it's hard to say. It's not like a formula. It's not you have to use this and this. But I will say, ideally, everybody goes through the 4 principles, the 4 facets of the wheel, so that they're not just focusing again on just design. As I'm an architect and urban designer, and there is a tendency of architects to just focus on design, right? We tend to sort of not think so much about the process or the context or even what happens after the project is completed. So the wheel helps you remember and remind people that there's these 4 principles that we should be aware of and definitely apply as much as we can.
And with the data, as you're collecting data and you work your way through the various metrics too, it's as important to remember what you collect, who you see, who's like in the space. If you're collecting sort of users of the space, who's not there. And if you look at the metrics, they'll help you punch out not only what's there, but what's not there. And when we're talking about equity inclusion, that's really, really important. The data that you see, you also have to ask questions, what are we not seeing?
Mm-hmm.
And Maki, you mentioned, the way that urban designers and architects and even planners like myself usually do things, but you all work with a number of different partners. How have each of the partners that you've been working with, the 4 partners that have been implementing this, been responding to the process?
Yeah, so we're currently working with 4 US organizations and over the next 2 years to really start to adopt and take the framework and use it, put it into action. And so those 4 organizations are APA, American Planning Association, LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, New Jersey Community Capital, and NRPA, National Recreation and Parks Association. So, many of them are membership organizations that work around the country and can really influence their members. And so that's a way to scale and disseminate this framework, right? So 2 of the organizations, for example, APA and NRPA, are really focused on creating a guide and a toolkit using this framework to integrate some of the principles and metrics into their work. Right? So it's a tool within their organization that they're adopting and disseminating. On the other hand, LISC, for example, is a national funder, nonprofit, and they're working with 2 community partners in Washington, D.C. and Houston on 2 public space projects. So they're concrete projects that they're working on, and they're looking at the framework and seeing which components can they apply in their process in designing this public space. And they're very much focused on, understanding community and engagement, right? So that's a way that they're using it. And then New Jersey Community Capital is a community development finance institution focused on community-wide development plan for the city of Paterson in New Jersey. So they're actually using the framework to really reshape the way its own organization is investing in community. So they're applying it in different ways. But the beauty of this is that, again, there's not one way to use it, but there's many different ways to use it. And our hope is that through partnering with the organizations like these, the IHP framework can be most scaled and disseminated amongst a wider audience.
And it's the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's hope that by helping to fund these applications and the scaling of the framework, that other organizations, membership organizations, community-driven organizations, that they see it, and then they get their own ideas about how to use the framework and how they can adapt it and adopt it for their own needs.
And what are you hearing from communities who are using the framework? Like, what's been some of the feedback that you've gotten?
So LISC, for example, they are working directly with community members and applying the framework. And of course, it is a very dense framework, as we mentioned, and so there's a lot to dissect, but it's received well. It's essentially also bringing awareness of how to be more intentionally inclusive in both the community engagement and design. And so I think it's been helpful for them as a tool to just bring awareness, not just for themselves, but to the community on how to approach and what are the metrics that we should care about. So far, so, pretty good. We'll see how it goes.
Has the pandemic impacted any of this work specifically? I mean, I imagine it has, but has there any way that you've seen that you've had to change ideas or thoughts or process things differently or react differently to the situation that's going on around the world?
Well, I think the pandemic has really created greater interest in public spaces as communities across the country and across the world have really, thought differently about their public spaces. They've had to use them in different ways. Everything from people think of public spaces and they think of parks, but the pandemic, we're thinking about all sorts of public spaces. It could be the public space in front of the municipal building. It could be the parking lot behind the municipal building where now people have to wait and gather and, line up to file a building permit or do a whole slew of transactions. These now are looked at and understood to be public spaces. So the importance of public spaces has really come into view during the pandemic. And I think communities too are thinking, okay, as we hopefully emerge from COVID, how do we think about these spaces differently? Because they are important community assets. And perhaps the way we've done things in the past do not have to be the way we do things going forward. We've seen how we've been able to use public spaces and cut through red tape because now we need those public spaces. We don't have the indoor spaces. So local governments have been quicker and more prone to cutting through some of the red tape that they had before in terms of programming space. The streets, the sidewalks, people now have a greater understanding of how important they are as part of public spaces, the public realm. It's not just thinking about a geographically defined space. So in that way, the pandemic has put a new light on our public spaces and broadened our idea of these public spaces. It's also, I think, gotten a lot of people thinking about how important these public spaces have to be as welcoming spaces for all people, because we know that's not true too. And that we need quality public spaces. We need quality green spaces for people to go to. It's important for their mental and physical and social health. So I think there's, again, a greater awareness of the importance of public space, the relationship to health, our physical, mental, and social health, and hopefully an awakening of how we program and invest in these spaces.
Again, we've always said streets are also part of the public realm. And I think with the pandemic, that awareness has heightened, and it's a great time for us to rethink about how we design the street. And again, I want to emphasize the point that Sharon said about who we invite, because public spaces are not created equal, and it's not the same for everyone. So I think with that greater awareness of not just the pandemic, but the social justice movement that has been happening in the past year, I think we have to be much more intentional about how we design these spaces. So we invite for everyone, people of different race, color, age, gender. These are all important things to consider in our design of public realm.
One of the things we learned in the process of learning about inclusive, healthy spaces is when we went outside the US to look at places, the difference, lingering, the invitation to linger in space. And we see it, I mean, you can see it in places in the US, but you really see it like you go to plazas in Italy, certain places, a lot of cities in Europe. The invitation is there to linger. The idea is to get people to stay. So often in the US, our public spaces is about getting people to move through them and not so much to linger. And in fact, in a lot of public spaces, what you see are prohibitions about lingering, right? They're called loitering. And we have laws that say you can't loiter in a public space. You cannot spend an excessive amount of time in a public space. And what we've seen too, and particularly in the last year, it's gone on for a long time, but in the last year, greater awareness around how these laws are applied. So for me, as a white woman, lingering in a public space, being in a public space, I may not be challenged. For a person of color, they are more likely to be challenged in that space. So what does that mean? How then does that reflect the values of the community? The Inclusive Healthy Places framework gives us a chance to peel through that onion, to maybe take a look at the laws and how we invite people in our spaces and how we disinvite, and how we apply the laws and the values and the priorities within our public spaces.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We talk a lot about it on the podcast, and we have a Monday show where we talk about a lot of different ideas and news and information. And what we've been talking about recently is the freeway fights that are going on in places like Portland and Houston and Austin, all over the country. And one of the things that we stress is the idea that we're trying to go to a place, not through a place. And I think that reflection of public spaces as the same good ideas that we should be focusing on in public spaces are the same good ideas that we should be focusing on in transportation. And they all interconnect. And it's really important that we kind of understand that we're trying to go to these places, not necessarily through them. Because if we go through them, we're ignoring them, we're othering them, we're not focusing on their well-being and their needs.
Yes, and we need to think about the whole journey if we're using public transportation. So you start at a bus stop or a train stop or in a transit center, however you're getting there. And then maybe you're making a transfer somewhere, and maybe you're getting off at another place and going through a park or a plaza. You're using the sidewalks. You're using public space to get to the next, whether it's a transit space or a library or some other public space. You're moving through spaces, and in each one of these spaces is a public space in and of itself. So how does the whole journey look? And how do you feel in those public spaces? How might someone else feel in those public spaces? How do you feel during the course of the day in those public spaces? Does it change? Does it feel better or worse? And again, who's there at different times of the day? And how does that make you feel? How do the other people that should be in this space feel? So it's really important to think about it as more than just one geographically defined place, and as you know, as part of a longer journey and movements throughout a day in these various public spaces.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But that also speaks a little bit to the conflicts that might occur when you're trying to plan the spaces or trying to be inclusive about spaces. How do you, deal with conflicts that might arise between different stakeholders who might have different goals for a place?
In our process, we had many people engaged with the process while we were developing the Inclusive Healthy Places framework. And when I say many different people from all different kinds of backgrounds and professional people that are, planners, architects, designers, finance people, community activists, regular citizens that we pulled into the process. The thing that galvanized everyone, that brought everyone together, was dignity. That we can all agree on whether or not a space provides dignity for you and for other people. And that was when we came together and really made some progress. When we can look at a space or at a series of public spaces and say, does that space provide dignity for me, for my neighbor, for my sister, my brother, however you define your sister, your brother, my child, my mother, my grandmother. And when you start thinking about dignity, you have a whole nother lens to think about the public spaces. And that was really the value or the virtue that we all came together on.
I love that, the word dignity. I think it's so key. We don't use those words in design and planning, right? But I mean, we talk a lot about social coexistence in our work. And part of that is communal dignity, right? That we can live together. And I just wanted to bring up an example of another body of work that we did in San Jose, where we essentially created a study to understand the coexistence in public space. And it essentially was an engagement tool for creating shared spaces with homeless people, unhoused people, right? And oftentimes there is this perception that, a certain group of people equate to some bad behavior. But this tool really helped us understand that that's not necessarily true, but really separate a group of people to the antisocial behavior, right? And so disassociate behavior to people and not make those pre-assumptions, right? And so this tool really helped people awaken and see that antisocial behavior doesn't only happen through the homeless people that they think are the bad people, but oftentimes they are just people who need a place to hang out, right? And they're not actually engaged in bad behavior, but we have a perception as a society, right, that homeless people equates to bad behavior. We need to rethink of how we look at both people and behavior, and it's just an awareness. And so again, I think in designing places, we need to think about that social coexistence and how can we become better at that. And with that, this idea of dignity for everyone comes into play.
One of the places we visited while we were developing the Inclusive Healthy Places framework was a park called Folkets Park in Copenhagen. And Folkets Park had been through a couple of different sort of redesigns, but it was in need of a do-over. And there had been a lot of mistrust in the community because of things that the community members, the people that lived around the park, wanted and didn't happen the last several times. So this time, the city of Copenhagen engaged an artist to work with community residents to kind of reimagine the space and what it could be. So Folkets Park was located outside the city center in a pretty dense neighborhood. One could say a transitional kind of neighborhood. There were the hipster types, young families, some professionals, social entrepreneurs. There were new immigrants to the community. There were homeless people that used the park. There was even, sort of a local gang that hung out in the park. The artist brought everyone together and brought them all into the process. And in doing so, it wasn't about coming up with solutions so much as what they wanted and what their vision for the park was and how it was and wasn't working for them. And one thing the homeless people said was that the lights in the park being too bright at night made them feel unsafe and made them feel vulnerable. So in the process, one of the things they did was they worked it so that there were lights in the park at night, but gave homeless people actually an area where the lights were dimmed so that they could sleep at night and not feel like they stuck out or not, pray for other people. What that did, I mean, people can think, oh, well, we don't want to invite homeless people in the park. But truth is, they were there because homeless people are unfortunately in a lot of parks and public spaces. It gave them a safe place and they are part of the community. So by making the homeless people safer, it made everyone safer and it gave everyone dignity within the space. It made them all feel like they were valued community residents and community clients of the park and the public space. They all became stewards of the place. It became a different kind of place going forward.
What does success look like in 5 years from the document, from your work with other communities, with other organizations? What does that look like?
Well, I would say success can come in many ways, but for sure, as a starting point, having a greater awareness about the need to be more inclusionary in our places. I think it needs to start with awareness, just, from both designers and sort of practitioners, both in the health equity environment and the built environment, just awareness of that. But then hopefully with that awareness comes the commitment and intentionality to design for more healthy and inclusionary cities and communities, right? So whether it's planners or designers or policymakers or health practitioners, I mean, for me, ultimately, if everybody considered this commitment of inclusive, healthy places in their body of work, I think we'll have come a long way. Today, we're not there yet. A lot of times people talk about it, but lacks sort of that intentionality. It's more of a checklist and not done with commitment.
One measure of success for us, I think, is creating awareness around inclusive, healthy places and getting people to think beyond design. People love to think about design. We're driven by it. We watch,
see it.
All the reality TV, the HGTV, or whatever it is, we want to design our living spaces better. And then when you take us outside, we want, we go right to design. This bench goes here and this swing should go there. But inclusive, healthy places are so much more than design. So we need to think about the whole space. We need to think about it 360 degrees, right? That it is, we have to think about the history of the place. Who uses the space beyond us? Beyond us being sort of the new group or the new users that come in and discovered this place and now want to sort of redesign it for, our use. Who else is there? What's the history, right? What's the process? How do we measure it going forward? How do we measure it? How do we sustain it? How do we program it without over-programming it, which is another sort of thing that people love to do, over-program the space, either under-program it or over-program it. So getting people to think about that. And also, public spaces for the full year, not just for the, when the weather is warm and, we like to be outside. We need those spaces all the time. So that's part of it. That's a measure of success. But how do we really bring people into the process and think about everyone in that space and having a value around that space for all people so that it can really create opportunities for health and for connection, to build our social networks, to build social cohesion in a place, to make community, to give us all a sense of belonging in our community, and with the emphasis on all.
I think those are examples of great metrics. If 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we could collect data about the sense of belonging of a community in a place, and if we hit the mark and everybody responds positively, we've done well, So I think, again, I'm going back to this idea of like the data that we collect is also very important, and what we collect, we need to also rethink what kind of data we're collecting, now and in the future, and that it's not just about infrastructure or product-based data, but really focused on the human.
What's the geography that you all hope to work with? I mean, there's so many different administrative boundaries. There's small spaces, there's large spaces, there's transit agencies, there's MPOs, there's city governments. What's the geography that you all hope to focus on? I mean, it could be all geographies.
Right. Well, I would say the inclusive healthy places framework can be used any place. So we don't have a hoped for geography so much as really that this is a tool and a methodology that can be used any place. It's not designed for one specific place. It's really designed for systems change, for more equitable, healthy places. And it can be used to break down structural racism. It's not the answer to structural racism, but it gives us a tool and a methodology to start peeling back and seeing the policies and actions that have been taken over time that undergird structural racism, that have created unhealthy places, unhealthy policies, and in some cases, even priorities and laws that are in places that separate us and don't bring us together. So it's not about one specific place. It's really meant, it's a systems change tool, if you will, that can be used in any place.
You all have been working on this for quite a while. Is there anything that's jumped out and surprised you or worked out a way that you might not have expected? You know, sometimes we expect things to go a certain way or direction. Is there anything that maybe is interesting but surprising? I love asking this question because I get these faces.
Mm-hmm.
Folks can't see the faces, but I can.
Thinking faces.
The thinking faces. The little hamster wheel is running.
You know, I don't know that this is a surprise so much, but I'll just say that I've appreciated how many people, once they sort of engage with the framework, with the wheel, as we call it, get excited by it, you know, and want to dig into it and want to think about how to use it. And then again, in the past year, how, you know, public spaces, how people have had this awakening around public spaces, see a need to be able to think about their public spaces and to create better public spaces, to think more broadly about the public spaces. I don't know if it's a surprise, maybe a little bit in terms of the last year, because, you know, who could ever imagine this? You know, I never thought about, like, surprised me, I never thought about parking lots so much as public spaces. And in the past year, I see how people are using parking lots that are public spaces, right? The parking lot behind a municipal building is a public space, but how now that's become an important public space and thinking about those spaces differently.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm repeating what you've already said, Sharon, but I think how we've changed the way we look at public spaces as a collective, just as people. And I think the potential of just the greater awareness of the potential of public spaces and the importance of, again, not just design, but there's a full process and that there needs to be engagement and that we need to create a sense of belonging and community and coexistence. And all of these things have sort of heightened in the past year. And I think that importance I do feel like there's a greater collective awareness just from the general public about the importance of public spaces. And so for me, having a tool like the IHP framework is really exciting. I think for those with whom I've shared, you know, I've gotten very good response. Of course, that's not just the answer. The IHP framework is not going to answer everything, but it is a tool. And it's just like, for me, a first step to getting to a better place in terms of community building too.
Well, I want to be mindful of your all's time. Thank you so much for joining us. Where can folks find the framework and maybe contact you if they want to find out more information?
Yes, absolutely. So currently it's available. If you just type in Inclusive Healthy Places Framework on Google, it'll pop up. So you can find it there, but you can also find it on our website, gehlpeople.com. And also I'm happy to be, reached out to and speak more about this framework.
And one thing I just want to add before we go that I want people to think about, that public spaces are really a reflection pool. They reflect our norms, our values, our priorities, our culture, our aspirations, and even our fears. What they represent yesterday and they represent tomorrow. And they really represent the promise of what can be when we really come together and think about our communities and what we want them to be.
That's very well said. That sounds like an episode title, Public Space as a Reflective Pool.
Okay, have at it.
Well, Sharon and Maki, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Hey, it was fun. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old daily cities news list by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.